what I've been asked to talk about is quite broad, the novel, and my kind of relationship to that genre, my own writing. It's extremely broad, in fact. So that's an advantage, but it's also a disadvantage. Taking advantage of the broadness, I have jotted down 7 points in the last half an hour, which might be a disadvantage as well. Anyway, but let me try to proceed. Abhi, is this kind of power cut or is a power cut? We'll come back.
Your rivals have got to know you're talking.
I thought so, yeah. I try to keep it very hush-hush, but so let me start. Let me just make it, to begin with, make it personal. But there's nothing personal about anything a writer is doing, because a writer is always, even when they're starting out, is responding to a culture and to other books. So there's nothing completely personal about anything a writer does. They are, right from the beginning, whether they know it or not, either trying to insert themselves into a tradition, trying to imitate certain gestures, and then finding that they don't fit, trying to think about what it is that doesn't make them fit. History and literary history changes constantly. We talk about genres, we talk about things like the novel as if they are givens, and the most informed of us speak about these things as if they're givens, and therefore we also even attack them as if they're givens. I don't want to talk about literature. I've had enough of that. Let's turn to sociology, etc. The fact is, of course, that literature changes very rapidly what that means. And so they say the cliche about politics, a week is a long time in politics. A week is a long time, period. You know, for a writer, a week is a very long time. So I want to go back to a time when I I got drawn to the idea of writing quite early, for whatever reason. So one spends a long apprentice period. For me, that apprenticeship started very early. It might have been. It started when I was in my first standard, in class 1, and the reason for that might have been to do with the fact that my parents only ever spoke to me in Bangla when I was a child. And this was not done out of any kind of nationalism, but simply out of some kind of notion to do with the organic that was part of Bengali culture. That, you know, and it's a very modern notion, this notion to do with the organic, that somehow we have to speak to our children in their mother tongue. So they spoke to me. I was growing up in Bombay. I was born in Calcutta. I was growing up in Bombay. They spoke to me in Bangla when I was very small, and the other language I knew was Hindi, from the Bombay Hindi, which people who worked in the house spoke to me in Bombay Hindi. So when I was admitted, so my father, however, was upwardly mobile. He was on this kind of upwardly mobile journey in the corporate world. So we were staying in quite posh locations now when I think of it. Malabar Hill. My father moved to Malabar Hill, and he put me in kindergarten over there in a school mainly full of European children. I hated school, and I didn't know any English. That was the other problem. So I remember spending time at the doorway waiting for my mother to come back to take me home. Then they put me into cathedral school, which is a very well-known English medium school. I didn't know any English. And the headmistress said to my mother, the headmistress was half Bengali, half English. She said, give him Ladybird books to read and comic books to read. And I began to read Ladybird books, Jane and John Go to the Beach, and comic books. And she said I would pick up the language very fast if I were exposed to these particular forms of literature. And I did pick it up very fast. I don't know, I can't remember how fast I picked it up, but soon in the first standard I was writing stories. And I became very happy about writing. I mean, maybe that was the only time I was happy about writing stories. I'm no longer happy about writing stories. But at that time I was happy about writing stories. And I think my first story was about a dog or a puppy. Because I always longed to have one. Again, I never had one. But so in many ways, I think that first foray into writing was also a kind of declaration that I picked up this new language. So it was an act of showing off, of proving to my parents that I knew English. So maybe there was always that going on in those first years in my kind of relationship with the written word, because I had not possessed English in my very early childhood. So the fact that I had begun to write it when I was 5 had that element of showing off about it, of having acquired something. My first love soon became poetry. And it continued to be poetry because of the kind of impact language seemed to have on me. It continued to be poetry for a long time. One of the things about an apprenticeship in writing is, of course, getting involved, heavily involved, not just in writing and in reading, but in the make-believe of being a writer. And I think V.S. Naipaul talks about how you want to be a writer long before you have anything to write about, in terms of those who indulge in that make-believe. So the first kind of act of fictionalizing that a fiction writer or a writer will do is in inhabiting this role of being a writer. And the role coming to us from Romanticism of the poet as a semi-fictional figure was increasingly clear. The novelist less so. At that time, what Auden said about the novelist was still true. You know, the novelist had to become the whole of boredom itself, while the kind of the poets were like young soldiers on horseback rushing off into some kind of even self-destruction. So there was something explosive about the personality of the poet, but there was also something going on about language itself with poetry, which you were very aware of right from the moment you saw it on the page. The fact that language does something more than just tell you something is very apparent from the way poetry appears on the page. I don't think that fascination, that language does more than tell you something, I don't think that fascination has ever gone away from me. Now, we forget that I think right until the late 80s or the mid 80s, so I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, right until the mid 80s, poetry was the genre, the literary genre which had the greatest prestige, and not, I think, the novel. So the great sort of creative practitioners in language were poets. If I think of England, since we're talking about English, I would say right to the mid to the late 80s, when we're thinking of the great creative practitioners in England, in the written word, we are not thinking even of William Golding. We are thinking of Ted Hughes and Philip Larkin. And that changes. So I wanted to be a poet. And so I finally tried to sort of make my way to England, and did a degree at University College London, and then I did a DPhil or a PhD at Oxford. My subterranean agenda was that I should become a world famous poet. I want to tell you a little bit more about that time when I was growing up, especially the 70s when I was a teenager and coming into some kind of consciousness about things, about writing, and of course the other personal kind of things one becomes conscious about, questions to do with who one is, one's sexuality, various other things. The malaise of being an adolescent. So into that fed certain philosophies that were dominant at the time, of which we had only a lay understanding. We only had a lay understanding of various things. So we had a lay understanding of something which was called existentialism. So does anybody know about existentialism, have some kind of idea? You've heard this word before, of course. So we had this idea about existentialism, about man's kind of agonized trajectory through the universe and through his life, his kind of baffled response and relationship to the universe. This was all our lay understanding. And another word which was in circulation then was this word that had been made popular by Albert Camus, but also by a school of drama called absurdist theater, was the word absurd. And so as teenagers we thought, yes, this is perfect, yeah, the existence is absurd. Absolutely, this works very well for me, you know. There is no meaning to existence. Into this, the kind of fragmentation of modernism seemed to play right into that. Everything is fragmentary, blah, blah, blah. It is all breaking down, etc. It fed into the same sort of economy to do with not only an alienation from one's surroundings, but to do with giving precedence to a particular tortured consciousness, and therefore to human consciousness, to a particular protagonist and their consciousness of the world, which was a tortured consciousness. So I spent my apprenticeship trying to be tortured and trying to embrace this. And of course, some of it was provided for by my hormones anyway, in the fact that I was a teenager, etc. The moment that changed, I remember when it changed, was I think in 1985, or 84 or 85. I was 22 or 23 years old. I was in England, I was in London. I was deeply miserable. And I was deeply miserable, and I had very clear ideas of what it meant to be a writer and a poet and what I should be writing about. And basically the literary themes and the legitimate literary emotions had to be with what I was talking about, the absurd, the existential, the tortured, alienated kind of relationship to the universe, the fragmentation as one saw it of civilization, of culture, which is how we read, for instance, a person who was very important at the time, both for his poetry and his criticism, T.S. Eliot. So T.S. Eliot is the guru of this kind of constant mourning of what industrialization and the world wars had done to this organic Western civilization, how it had disintegrated, how these fragments we must shore against these ruins, etc. You know, how we must make the best of salvage the best we can in the midst of all this. This tragic gesture is something that deeply sort of had appealed to me when I was 21 years old. Suddenly, so now, the other thing I was thinking was how long can I continue this kind of personal trajectory, this shrewd strategy of being a student of literature while my actual agenda is to be a published poet and a world famous poet. How long will it take me to become this world famous poet, and how long can I continue down this route to get funding or some kind of reason to be here in England while I'm on this quest. So I wanted to get a first class, because I knew that otherwise I'm not going to get funding to do my DPhil. But I knew that getting a first class was very difficult. So I finally found a tutor in my final year called Dan Jacobson, wonderful, great South African writer. And it was the first time I felt some happiness because he liked my essays. We began to have chats, we began to talk. And then I once put to him, what do I have to do to get a first? So he said, I think you have a first-class literary sensibility. He was very generous, a very generous man. But I don't think you have read enough prose. I think you've read a lot of poetry, but you haven't read enough prose. So he made me a list of books to read. Gulliver's Travels. Journal of the Plague Year. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, which I hadn't read. There were 6 of those. The one modern novel which he chose was D.H. Lawrence's Sons and Lovers. He was an admirer of D.H. Lawrence. So I went back home, and one day, after having plowed through Journal of the Plague Year, etc., with a great deal of bemusement, I began to read Sons and Lovers. Sons and Lovers is the first book which I read where a modern man who knew the tricks of, or the skills of modernist language, and I'll come to that in a second, where he knew all of that, was not inhabiting that position where he was saying, however, European man is in a state of fragmentation. Man is in a state of fragmentation. Civilization has broken down. And I'm full of despair. Which is the lay kind of gloss on, let's say, T.S. Eliot. He seemed to be saying, the here and now is what matters. This is what Lawrence seems to be saying in Sons and Lovers. He's suddenly talking about a very small sort of mining town which is vivid with life, and declaring that life that happens here and now and in the here and now is all that matters. So he's making a rejection. He's making a refutation which at any point of time is extraordinary, and is certainly extraordinary at that moment, where he's turning away from that moment of despair in the disintegration of Western civilization and celebrating the here and now. Where does that come to from Lawrence? Look, Lawrence, before he died, wrote in a very strange book called Apocalypse, which was his kind of gloss on the Revelations, which is a part of the Bible which is near gibberish. He wrote this kind of very interesting book, giving us his very idiosyncratic view of the Bible and his point of view. And he begins almost on the first page by critiquing this idea of consciousness being something that has great integrity and reality. He just says consciousness is an illusion. What we are, what man is or woman is a kind of illusion. It doesn't have any actual reality. But he affirms the kind of, not only the reality, but the immediacy of the world. This great vividness and immediacy of existence. He affirms that, while he rejects this idea of this consciousness with integrity and clear outlines. And he says, and now he's about to die. He knows he's suffering from consumption. He says, what I'm trying to remember his exact words, but whatever man might know, he cannot know the marvel. Whatever man might know in the hereafter, whatever the unborn might know, or whatever man might know of the hereafter, he cannot know the marvel of being alive in the flesh. Now again, this is a refutation of, what should I say, metaphysics in favor of the physical. A refutation of metaphysics, which basically means, metaphysics means my meaning, the meaning of something must come from elsewhere. So whether it's from a Western civilization in the past, European civilization which has gone through a process of disintegration, or whether in theological terms it means heaven, which is the hereafter, something that gives meaning to what you see, your present life. Something else, not here but elsewhere, to quote Tagore, not here but elsewhere. So he's refuting that elsewhere, which Tagore also did. There are two sides to Tagore. One side says, not here but elsewhere. The other side says, Jagote ananda jogya aman nemontonu. Into the feast of life, I have been invited. So that's this other side of Tagore, which embraces the here and now. As Lawrence is embracing the here and now, and thereby rejecting this idea that meaning must always come from somewhere else. He's getting this line of thought from Nietzsche. Nietzsche of a particular book, The Gay Science, in which he says you must embrace your fate. Embrace life. So this anti-metaphysical kind of move, this refutation, informs all of Lawrence's writing. It's an extraordinary gesture, and it spoke to me. I suddenly realized, oh my God, I've been agonizing all these years, wanting to be agonized. Actually, I'm not agonized at all. To me, the here and now is of great importance. I must write about the here and now. This is what is of great value to me. Then I thought, that means all the things that are of great value to me are extremely mundane, unimportant, and unliterary. They are not literary at all by any stretch of the imagination in terms of legitimacy given to certain subjects and themes by literature. So I want to write about my uncle on the toilet seat. This is not literary. I want to write about Calcutta. This is not literature. A particular kind of middle class Calcutta in Bhawanipur, which I'd never named in that first novel, where the uncle goes off to smoke a cigarette and read the newspaper, goes with an ashtray into the bathroom to shit on the commode, but also read the news of the day. This for me had not come with the imprimatur of the literary. Now when I realize that actually this is what I love, the here and now is what I love, that Lawrence's book opened up things to me and my own temperament to myself. Because what I loved was not only the mundane, but an opening up of life and also one's interiority into the exterior world. Because of that, I also, although I wrote the book in the past tense, I didn't write it as once upon a time he was a child, those were the golden days of childhood. I didn't do that. It was not an elegy, it was not a memoir, it was not about memory. It was about what is to happen. What is to happen are these days in Calcutta during the holidays. This is how I decided to write the book. When I decided to write the book in that way, I was also sloughing off my old self, which had been besotted by the absurd, by the existential. Then I suddenly realized all these people who I thought were existential, agonized, and devotees, acolytes of the absurd, they actually had this deeply carnal and humorous side to them. They were as in love with life as Lawrence was. And I thought, Bergman, Ingmar Bergman, how could I have thought that this is a man who loves the absurd? He loves life. Even in a film about death, he's in love with life. This is The Seventh Seal. And of course, there are the comedies, Smiles of a Summer Night. And Fanny and Alexander, they're all about process, flux, and life opening out. So I thought, oh my God, what had I been seeing in a cinema? You know, he's not an existentialist at all. He's not an allegorist of alienation. He is talking about life. The same life that Lawrence was talking about, the here and now. I saw the same thing in Kafka. I used to think Kafka was, again, an allegorist of some metaphysical state of alienation. Suddenly I saw that he had described the cockroach with such delicate detail, the ridges and the coverlet, which is about to slip off. And given only some kind of primacy to the cockroach's consciousness of being a cockroach, remaining an insurance salesman and thinking I have to go to my job. There's this boss who always sits on the desk while he talks to me and looks down at me. I don't know why he has this kind of habit. And then one of the most beautiful parts of Kafka's Metamorphosis is when the sister suddenly realizes that he might want rotting food. So he no longer likes to eat proper food. He likes food which has gone off slightly. So she leaves stuff for him. Chicken, white sauce congealed on it, going off. A cheese which Gregor a few days ago had said was unfit for human consumption. So this little joke that he had said that, Gregor a few days ago, unfit for human consumption. So there's this astonishing list written with the most delicate poetic precision, written by a man who loves the features of the world. I thought, I had missed that completely when I read Kafka. I was looking for some higher meaning. I was looking for a metaphysical state of some other kind. Where were all these things when I read Metamorphosis last time? So I suddenly began to realize that the people I thought were votaries and high priests of this kind of absurdist state which spoke directly to my teenage agonized self-consciousness were actually votaries for life, you know. So Camus is the same. I'll come back to Camus a little later. Now, I don't have much time, so because we need to open it up to questions as well, but I want to cover a few more points. At that time, soon the context for Indian writing for English would become a very definite context. And that context, as I was beginning to decide for myself what kind of writer I would be, that context would be determined by the publication of Midnight's Children and its reception, and the inception of post-colonial studies, mainly informed by Edward Said's Orientalism and its concern with misrepresentations by Orientalist writings of the Orient. So the only question then seemed to become, seemed to have to do with the appropriation of the Orient and the exercise of power and dominance over the Orient through a particular kind of representation of the Orient, and the only response to that then would need to be the appropriation back of the Orient, stealing it back, and the writing back to the empire, which was the big story in those days. To this, then, we must add that while all this was happening, certain value judgments were being made and certain general categories were being invented. Of course, Rushdie himself was partly invented in this way. Rushdie is a much richer and much more unexpected writer than this post-colonial reading makes him seem to be, because he's partly surrealist. He's been formed by filmmakers like Buñuel. He's partly being formed by comedians like Spike Milligan. You know, but none of that comes into the readings of Rushdie in this particular allegorical mode. So what are the things that then begin to be emphasized? One of the things that begins to be emphasized, because I'm going to try and keep this short, is the idea of storytelling itself. The idea of storytelling as not only being somehow empowering. somehow definitive of post-colonial societies, of non-Western societies. So then you suddenly began to get this dichotomy. Western societies were formed by the Enlightenment. They believe in inscription, they believe in writing. The oral cultures are the non-Western cultures. They believe in storytelling, they believe in kind of, a kind of expansiveness. I was all for expansiveness, but I didn't quite like this expansiveness being appropriated or made subservient to this, what became a kitsch, increasingly kitsch idea of storytelling. And then a sort of emphasis given to narrative. That is the other thing that came to be emphatically repeated again and again. All these novels were, they dealt with narrative in a particular way. So when we then talk about narrative, we have come a long way from poetry. One of the things about poetry is its kind of weirdly irresponsible air. As Auden said, poetry makes nothing happen. I was very interested in nothing happening. I was interested in a space in which nothing happened. I was interested in film in which nothing happened. I was interested in time in which nothing happened. I was interested then in narrative in which nothing happened. So if nothing happens in narrative, is it narrative? Is it storytelling? Is it empowering? It seemed not. Then what is narrative doing? I want to give you an example from Indian culture to do with narrative and to do with poetry, to do with the poetic. And I want to give you the best examples of both. I'm not giving you kitsch examples. I have no post-colonial reasons to be telling you about these particular examples. I'm giving you what for me is one of the great examples of storytelling, the Mahabharata. One of the great examples of narrative. This kind of narrative, as you know, at one time was called itihas. Now that word is used for history. At that time it was a word used for narrative. Then you have the interruption within the Mahabharata, the Gita. The Gita of the Krishna of the Gita is a Krishna who has almost become language. What we know of the Gita is what Krishna says. The Krishna of the Mahabharata is a Krishna more related to the Krishna of the Bhagavad Puran. The Krishna who as a child went around harassing women, or taking their kind of clothes away when they were bathing, trying to kind of steal butter. This mischievous Ovidian Krishna, the one Krishna who keeps transforming himself, is the Krishna of this wonderful story, the Mahabharata. What I'm interested in is what narrative, if Mahabharata is narrative, and what the Bhagavad Gita does in terms of time and how we read and respond to these two texts. Let me first speak about the Gita. When we come to the Gita, suddenly in the middle of the Mahabharata, when the Pandavas are going to go to war with the Kauravas, and Krishna is advising Arjuna about the need for action without thinking of the fruit of action, and advising him how to go about and act, and basically act in sort of committing an act of war against people he has known since childhood. As he says, how can I fight my cousins, my uncles, etc. While he's doing that, Krishna talks about various things, talks about himself. and talks about what this action might be. But it does so in constantly paradoxical terms. So when Arjun asks Krishna to reveal himself, he reveals himself for some time, but the revelation is so intolerable in its vastness that Arjun can't take it and tells him to stop. Then Krishna begins to talk about who he is. He says, I am, the light of the moon that you see on the water, I am that light. The light of the sun you see over there, I am that light. So basically, there is a disjunct between the Krishna, the charioteer, and the Krishna who is visible but not visible. We see the strange Krishna who is everywhere but not everywhere as a visible or understandable entity. I am the light of the moon that you see reflected on the water. I am that light. Then Krishna advocates an idea of action which is strange. Says that you have to act with passion but dispassionately. This is basically what Krishna is saying. You have to act without thinking of what the outcome of action might be. You have to act passionately and immerse yourself in the action without thinking of what that outcome of that action might be. This is the way that people later on will think of both the critical and the creative act as an action without outcome. We don't know what the outcome is going to be. Matthew Arnold, who is the person who begins to formulate this idea of the disinterested critical act. Now when we look at the word disinterested, we immediately think it must come from some Western tradition of objectivity. Actually, Arnold is reading the Gita. Reading the Gita is making him aware that it might be possible to think of a particular kind of action which is at once passionate and dispassionate. When you're doing something, but it has no outcome, or no outcome that you can be clear about. This idea is going to deeply inform how we think about both the creative and the critical in the 19th and 20th centuries. Also this idea of somebody being visible but not visible, this paradoxical idea which Krishna gives us. I'm this, I'm that, you see me in the light of that. Again, this is the way modernism and the idea of the author is created as being a dispassionate creator. A creator almost without desire. That is, the author has no agenda. And this strange idea that the author is writing something but they don't have an agenda. Why are they writing then? Goes back to a kind of idea of Flaubert's, which is quite influential, where he says, the author, like God, is everywhere present in the universe, but nowhere visible. Like God is everywhere present in the universe, but nowhere visible. The author is similarly everywhere in his work, but nowhere visible in it. So the idea of the author somehow being both in the work and out of it, working through it but not being in it, is very similar to the way we are thinking about, the way Krishna is talking, the Gita is talking about Krishna. So, when we read the Gita, we are under its spell as it works out these paradoxes, which are often paradoxes that are key to the way we think about writing, writers, the creative and the critical act today. We fall into a kind of spell when we read the Gita. It's the spell of poetic language, which is the language of ambiguity and paradox. And when the Gita ends, we are not sure what we have learned, really. What new information we've got is something we are not sure about. What we do know is that we undergo a transformation. A change takes place within us as we read and when we end reading the Gita. And we are not sure what the transformation means in terms of knowledge. This, I think, is the hallmark of poetic language, of reading through something, of inhabiting something for a particular duration and feeling a transformation, feeling a change, but not knowing what it is really that you've learned during that period of time. So the thing about poetic language, the thing about the poem, or the interruption that the poem represents, means that having read it, you can read it, start reading it again, almost immediately. You can, having read the poem, because you have not learned anything, the crossword puzzle hasn't been solved, what has taken place is a change, and once you finish it, you go back to the beginning and you read it again. You again undergo that change. Again, you learn nothing new. The thing about narrative is that you learn something. So by the end of the Mahabharata, great narrative that it is, I'm not demeaning its value. It's great value. It's one of the great narratives known to human culture. You have learned, you have seen the passage of time, you have learned something by the end of it. You know what happened to these people. A particular kind of appetite, although it works on various levels, has been addressed. A particular kind of appetite which has to do with what happened to these people, these characters. So we don't immediately go back and go through it again. There is no need to do that. A particular need to do with knowing who these characters were and what their story was has been satiated by the time we finish narrative. There is no great urge to go to the beginning and start again. With the poem, there is no such satiation as such. You can go back immediately and begin again and undergo that same process of transformation. So I'm making this distinction between what narrative is and what poetic language is. And I'm saying that as a novelist, like some modernist novelists, I wanted to take it in the direction of poetic language. That is, the novel would be about what happens in between. The novel would be an interruption. We would not know what we had learned additional to what we didn't know before after we finished the novel. I wanted to take it in that direction. Some others did as well, you know. So there's a line of that modernist novel coming out of Woolf and Proust and people who write novels about one day, like James Joyce or Virginia Woolf again. These novelists kind of overturn the hierarchy of grammar as we understand it. Grammar, as we understand it, is meant to take us from one place to another. The thing we look least at in a grammatical sentence are the conjunctions, are those joins which come in between. These novelists give precedence to those things which come in between, rather than the business of the general, the conventional grammar of getting from one bit to the other. By this time, I would say that by the 90s, however, narrative had come to be, storytelling had come to be identified as an Indian thing. But my exposure to Indian writing told me that this wasn't the case, that that Indian writing from long ago, right to now, in various ways, in periodic bursts, had always been addressing those interruptions. In fact, often they were less interested in story than in this kind of moment of expansiveness that happens in between. So, when Aruni asked me to say something about the Picador Book of Modern Indian Literature, which I edited, and I will end on that note, that I use the word modern deliberately. I wanted to speak about a kind of cluster of writings from the middle of the 19th century onwards to the present day, but do so not through the lens of the post-colonial, with all the kind of vocabulary that came along with that, but through the lens of the modern, which had its own agendas. And I find that that Indian writing in the Indian languages has been, in the last 100 years, a site for a cosmopolitan and avant-garde preoccupations, which are always challenging this kind of grammar that I've been talking about, this language of narration. Rather than being about storytelling and empowering storytelling and about writing back to the empire, they have been about idiosyncratic projects overturning conventional ideas of narrative. This is what so much of the Indian writing of the last 100 years has been about. And I wanted to then bring in the word modern to understand what was the context, what was that modernity in which this was happening. So I think I'll end it there, and because again, just this last point to do with India's modernity leads onto so much that I think it's better to abort. Thank you.
Thank you, Amit, and I'm sure there'll be questions, so you can't let us. Go for it.
Yeah.
Could you speak a little about how modern Indian literature fades into absurdism and go back to Camus?
Okay, go back to Camus, of course. Yeah. I had mentioned Camus earlier, and I was mentioning him in relation to this whole kind of reappraisal that I had within myself, where I suddenly began to realize I had completely misjudged or misunderstood people like Bergman and Kafka and Beckett, in seeing them as being sort of writers who in some simple way represented my own teenage understanding of the absurd and of existentialism. And what I was saying is, I suddenly began to see their deep affinity for the texture of physical life. I think that's one simple way of putting it. The textures of physicality of the world, that they had this great affinity and love of it. Something I didn't know earlier, I hadn't seen earlier. While this reappraisal was going on in me, there was a reappraisal going on in the world, which is also interesting. See, I've just spoken to you about Rushdie. I've spoken to you about post-colonial literature. There was post-modernity, globalization. And globalization, one of the things that globalization, post-modernity was doing was, in its own way, rejecting that earlier angst and bringing in this new air of celebration. But this new air of celebration was deeply related also to the new pieties of globalization, which often had to do with the market. So the globalization brought in an ethos where the market gave us a language for celebration, of increase, of plenty, of people reading more and more. I mean, these are phrases used by marketing people for chain bookshops. Booker Prize, who became deeply invested in the market. These became market mantras of always talking about the incremental, what was growing. So the market always had to be speaking about things that were growing. The market was growing. Wealth was growing. The GDP was growing. There was the whole kind of narrative about growth and celebration connected to that. To not fit into that celebration was to be very odd. Is to a certain extent still to be very odd. To not fit in. Now there have been market crashes, so it's not so odd anymore. But there was a time when you had to be peculiar to dissent from this story of celebration, which the market represented, and which subtly brought into it the way we spoke about books and writers as well. I am talking about a different kind of celebration. I'm talking about a rejection of the metaphysical and an embrace of life, of the here and now. I just told you a different kind of reappraisal was taking place at the time when I began to think of Bergman and Kafka in a different way. And part of the reappraisal had to do with Camus. So I can't remember when Camus' novel, which was posthumously published, came out, The First Man. It was 1990 or 91. I may be wrong, but I think it was around then. That was a momentous kind of occasion, the publication of The First Man, because it was the first time that suddenly readers became aware of the fact that Camus had loved life and loved sunlight and loved Algeria and loved streets and loved the sea. Then it also began to come out that Camus had always deeply felt homesick for Algeria in Paris. He was never happy in Paris. So the fact that Camus had a body, that Camus responded to the light, is something we would not have talked about in the 60s or 70s. So this kind of, what should I say, this physicality, this carnality in Camus, which we began to suddenly become aware of after The First Man was published, his lifelong homesickness for sunlight was a revelation to us. It took us away from all that talk about the absurd and suddenly led us to a man who had loved life. The second moment of reassessment occurs in relation to George Orwell, also at the same time. Orwell, when we were growing up, was known basically again for two allegorical books, Animal Farm and 1984. Not his best work. But they worked well to kind of, again, serve as an allegorical landscape to do with man. Suddenly, Orwell's hack work, these tiny bits of journalism he used to write, began to come to the forefront. Dirty postcards created by this brand name Donald McGill, sold on beaches, maybe in pre-war Britain. English tea, second-hand bookshops, English food, much maligned. He makes a case for it. Suddenly we saw this other Camus, the Camus who tasted, who liked these nooks and corners, who picked up these postcards, who was again embracing the world and the kind of social world, the working class world as well. So Again, I would say Orwell's capacity for joy, Camus' capacity for joy had not been apparent to us in the way we read them until the early 90s. This led to a kind of, what should I say, a subtle change in tone, a kind of celebration being made possible, which was very different, I have to say, from the celebration of globalization. It was a different kind of celebration. It was an attempt to create a lineage to do, which goes back not only to Lawrence saying that the marvel of life, but goes further back, but which we had been deflected from when we looked at the history of modernism. So that's why I mentioned Camus as being very important to me. This kind of the publication of The First Man. Was there another question related to that you asked?
Just about how Indian literature, modern Indian literature, fades into absurdism, if at all.
I think absurdism is a myth, actually, because actually when you look at it, whether it's modern Indian literature or anything else, it's actually as much beholden to this kind of affinity to life as anything else, and to humor. It's extremely humorous. So, and I think the best Indian literature, even when it's modernist, as I said, the preoccupations are often modernist and experimental, are not absurdist as I understood that term as a teenager. It's deeply reckless and buoyant. Yeah, that's not what absurdism is supposed to be. Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
I think he had asked something.
Yeah,
So this is just a basic question about writing.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's a whole question about whether you write about something you know, or whether you write not necessarily about narratives that we are familiar with, narratives of, say, marginalized people. So where would you stand with regards to that? Would you say write about what you know, which means propagating the same kind of, say, lifestyles maybe you live, or do you write from, I don't know, position of privilege about people who don't occupy the same life that you do? So how do you go about that question also? It's something that I've always...
See, two answers to that question. Both of them are not going to be sort of satisfactory, most probably. I would say this, firstly. How you are affected by a form of life, or a kind of life, which is on the edges of the kind of life which determines the parameters of how you think, is not something that's going to come up necessarily as the determination to include a character representing something. The process of osmosis is always taking place. One of the things that is happening is understanding the limits of language itself. Dipesh Chakraborty talks about this when he, in his short essay, I think it's called Minority Past Subaltern Histories, or Subaltern Past Minority Histories, I can't remember what, in Provincializing Europe. He talks about this dichotomy that the historian faces with the historian's language. He says that Ronajit Guha faced this problem, that he was writing about a particular nationalist peasant uprising led by a peasant leader, and then the peasant leader said, yes, I could act in that way because the Devi or whatever came to me. Also, the mathematician Ramanujan said the same thing. I could come up with these theorems because the Devi appeared to me. So then Ranjit Guha says, here I have to stop. As a historian, I cannot go there. Because I don't understand this kind of nationalism. It's very important, but I can't understand what lies behind it when you say the Devi asked me to do it. This is the limit of of my language as a historian. So, as a writer, nudging the limits of that language, and maybe through osmosis, allowing some of that language to come in, is what is important. To constantly question what it is you understand by what is rational or middle class or what is not. To constantly question that is what is important, rather than a determination to say, can I write about the working class character in that way? Because osmosis is anyway taking place and it's having disruptive effect on you and your writing, and it's opening up things for you. I'll give you one example. Ritwik Ghatak. Ritwik Ghatak has learned a lot from German expressionists. An amazing visual sense. Now and again, what you see kind of peculiar disruptions where melodrama comes in. And you can think to yourself that the melodrama is part of the osmosis, which is disrupting that language. But then you think to yourself, are you saying to me that melodrama is somehow a native form more organically than economy and control? That economy and control are European, while melodrama and disorder are non-European? Are you saying that even that doesn't work? The categories are constantly realigned. The epic and the miniature are constantly realigned. In front of the fresco near Mahabalipuram, Arjun's Penance, we're looking at this astonishing fresco carved out of rock about Arjun in various stages of penance. You see the Brahmin starving with the stomach caving in, and the corrupt Brahmin as cat with the pot belly, and you see all of that. It's epic. It's also very, very precise. And then you see, on your right, you see, again carved out of stone, but an independent sculpture, one monkey sorting out lice from another monkey's hair. And suddenly, in the midst of the epic, there's a telescoping into the miniature. There is absolutely no reason why that should be there. So then you realize, hang on, I have to go through another realignment. I cannot say that this was native, this was not, this is, so what I'm saying is that we are to write is to be in that state of flux. It's not just to say, can I write about a way of life which is not mine? That way of life is impacting on us, but we cannot make any clear decision about what its outlines are. So it's always to be in a state of interrogation and flux. Is that okay?
Thank you.